W6NBC. It is with great pleasure I introduce to you our guest speaker tonight, Mr. John Portune, W6NBC. You may remember he gave an excellent talk to our club in March about stealth slot antennas, and he very graciously has agreed to come back this evening and talk with us all about auto tuners. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, John, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure. I have a special place in my heart for this club. Way back in the 80s, I gave my first public presentation to this club on NiCad batteries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, don't know if there's anybody around who will remember it. Anyway, let's share my screen here and get to the presentation. Oh, I need to have screen sharing enabled by the host.
Sorry, just 1 moment.
What happened?
He's getting things fixed up here.
Sorry about that. I'm having trouble finding the setting for that.
It's under the green button, share screen, the little arrow to the right. Let everybody share.
All right. That's sharing all participants.
Interesting. Mine's in the center on the bottom.
Right there, center bottom, click the up arrow and you should see everyone can share.
Yeah, so that should be available now.
Okay, it is. Thank you very much. Okay, is everybody seeing the title slide?
Yes.
Good. If you have thumbnails over on the right of your screen, a row of, you want to turn them off so you don't obscure some of the slides. And the way you turn them off is that little negative arrow, that little minus sign up at the top of the row. Just click and it'll shut down all the little thumbnails. All righty. Okay, this is an interesting topic that I was asked to put together by the Pentagon Amateur Radio Club. They meet in the Pentagon and they have an auto tuner there hooked up to an antenna on the roof. And some of the members want to know how in the heck it works. So I put this presentation together. Antenna tuners. They're an interesting topic in ham radio, a lot of mystery about them. And antenna tuners go way back. They go right back to the early days of radio. And I don't know if any of you still have one of these antiques. Still a very good manual tuner, the old famous Johnson Viking Matchbox. So tuners are not exactly anything new to ham radio. But there still is a lot of mystery about tuners. We have a lot of myths about them, opinions about them that are incorrect. And so it's tuners, particularly auto tuners and particularly remote auto tuners, are pretty much undiscovered country for a lot of hams. And a lot of hams, if they've heard of the idea of a remote auto tuner, say, why in the heck should I own one of those? I'm real happy with my with the tuner I've got in my Kenwood. So we're going to talk about that. Many misconceptions persist about tuners. One of the reasons, and that has always been true about tuners and why they're mysterious to hams possibly, is because there really are two categories of tuners. And we'll look at those here presently. The two basic categories are in-shack tuners, the ones you put by your radio. And these are used for resonant antennas. We'll define resonant antennas here in a minute. And remote tuners, which are to be used with non-resonant antennas. And again, I'll define the difference between those two in a minute. And for a long time, though, the remote non-resonant antenna auto tuner was not well known in ham radio. It's a somewhat of a newcomer. Well, here's a typical in-shack manual tuner. Many of you may have something like it. I own one of these. Good manual tuner, good Husky manual tuner. But many of you may think, oh, well, that's the only tuner I'll ever need, because won't it tune up nearly everything? Well, it's capable of tuning up a tremendous number of antennas and other things, shopping carts if you want, but it's not by any means the only tuner you'll ever need, as I'm going to show you here tonight. Some of you may have a tuner in your shack like this. I don't know if you've got a fancy radio like this or not. That's a nice radio, Kenwood TS990. And you notice the arrow pointing over to the button marked AT for automatic tuner. Maybe some of you have modern rigs that have auto tuners built into them, and you might think that's the only tuner I'm ever going to need. That's going to tune up everything I have ever get in ham radio. Oh no, it won't. Don't believe that. If that's part of your toolkit, throw it out, because it's not true. It isn't the only tuner you'll ever need. Here's another in-shack tuner. These have become quite popular. This is the big Palstar full gallon auto tuner. Nice box. This goes in your shack. I happen to have an SDG remote automatic tuner here in my shack too, AT1000. It works very well too, but it's an in-shack auto tuner. And good box. But it isn't the only tuner, nor is this one the only tuner you'll ever need. The other class of tuner, which in the early days were called long wire tuners, or they really should be called non-resonant antenna tuners, remote auto tuners. These are antenna tuners that go not in your shack, but at the antenna. And that might seem like a misnomer to some hams that, well, don't all tuners go in your shack? No, they don't. Here's, in fact, the original auto tuner, the remote auto tuner that came onto the market a long time ago. I had one of these, pretty good tuner, the SGC 239. You can actually still buy these. They're a good remote auto tuner, 200-watt remote auto tuner. I've used this to tune up antennas remotely, and I used it in my car as a mobile auto tuner. And you might be thinking, oh, I'll never need one of those. I've got this wonderful tuner in my rig. No, you may need one of these, depending upon the type of antenna that you got hanging out there. Here's perhaps the original long wire tuner, as it was originally called. It's actually a remote auto tuner. And you can still buy it, $299, made by ICOM, the little AH4. I have one of these bolted into the back of the bed of my pickup truck, and I use it to tune up a CB whip on my pickup truck. I like auto tuners. They're great devices, and you can still buy one of these. Good little job. It'll handle, I think, 150 watts or 120 watts, which is pretty much all most people run in a mobile. That's why I moved it out there. Here's another remote auto tuner that you can buy these days. That goes out at the antenna, the MFJ 993 BRT. I've used several of these, and they work quite well. Their only shortcoming is, like some other MFJ products, their construction is a little bit thin, and you might need to seal the case a little bit better. But it'll handle 300 watts, and it's sort of reasonably priced at $350. It'll certainly tune up a lot of antennas of the non-resonant type, as we will see. But there is a good reason why you might need one of these antenna tuners, even though you've got something fancy sitting right beside your rig. The reason number two that you might need one is that there are two categories of antennas, just like there are two categories of tuners, and they match each other, as a matter of fact. So there are two categories of antennas. So let's make this clear. The two kinds of antennas that exist are resonant antennas. You might think that's the only kind of an antenna there is. No, lots of very effective ham antennas are non-resonant antennas. And it may be a misnomer seeming to some of you, but it's not. Increasingly, non-resonant antennas in the ham world are becoming common. I use one all the time. Okay, here are some resonant antennas. These are the kind most hams are most familiar with. And you can see 4 examples here of resonant antenna. What's a resonant antenna? Well, it's kind of defined like over there at the right for the Hustler, that Hustler 5BTV, I think that is. And it's a resonant antenna because on the bands that you use it, it has a low SWR. In fact, you can see the SWR curves. I think they're a little bit fudged in their advertising, but they do have low SWR on the bands you use them on. And that's what makes them resonant. They have a low SWR at the frequency you use them on. On the middle there, at the bottom is a spider beam. Spider beams, maybe some of you have one of them. Good antennas, interesting design, nice bit of engineering. And they have a series of 5 or 6 loops, all of which are resonant. That is, they are tuned to a particular frequency, and at that frequency, they have a low SWR. Up at the upper left there is a typical resonant antenna, a big multi-band beam. But all of the elements in that antenna are resonant. That is, they have a low SWR at the frequency they're made to run at in the ham bands. And of course, most hams have built themselves a dipole at one time or another and use the famous formula down there, 468 over megahertz, to make the dipole like that inverted V that I'm showing there. And that too is a resonant antenna. Remember, resonant antennas have a low SWR at the frequency or frequencies you want to use it at. That's the definition of a resonant antenna. And for a lot of hams, they may think this is the only kind of antenna there ever is. No, not so. Lots of non-resonant ones coming up. Here are some non-resonant antennas. I'm showing you at Humvee over there on the left. That antenna, the military uses it. And it's a non-resonant antenna, as a lot of mobile whips are. And not surprising, you'll see right next to it is a remote auto tuner. Looks like that SDG remote auto tuner. And the military is very fond of non-resonant antennas on their vehicles fed with a remote auto tuner. That's why the Pentagon has one. Also down there at the bottom, this is something some of you may have done. Put up a loop of wire around the eaves of your house. But chances are it's a non-resonant loop of wire. It may not be tuned to any given band. That's why, as you see it here, it has a remote auto tuner feeding it. And that's basically the right way to feed an antenna like that. On the right, upper right, you see one of those little AH4s, ICOM AH4s, originally called a random wire antenna tuner. And indeed here, it is feeding a piece of random wire or a non-resonant antenna. That helix of wire that they've wound around up maybe that flagpole, that windsock pole, is a non-resonant piece of wire. You probably can't, it's probably not, hasn't got a low SWR on any ham band. And that's what's characteristic of a non-resonant antenna. It does not have a low SWR on any band that you want to transmit on. That's the definition of a non-resonant antenna. There are a lot of non-resonant antennas out there. You may be using some of them. The ZEP, the Wyndham, the G5RV, the random long wire, off-center fed dipoles, or suppose you want to tune up your 40-meter dipole on 20 meters. It becomes a non-resonant antenna. These are all non-resonant antennas, common, good antennas, and a lot of hams use them. They use other methods to make them resonant, but basically they're non-resonant antennas, as their physical structure is a piece of wire that is not naturally low SWR. But here's the king of all modern non-resonant ham antennas. Some people think this antenna is a miracle antenna. The famous 43-foot vertical with 16 43-foot radials a couple of feet above ground. Great antenna, has great characteristics. A lot of hams like these antennas, but it is a non-resonant antenna. It's an antenna that you can't use with the tuner in your shack. You have to have a remote auto tuner for this antenna, and I'm going to show you why. Here is an easy neck SWR sweep of a 43-foot vertical mounted over 16 43-foot radials a foot above ground. Notice the SWR curve, the red line, across the hall of the HF band from 3.5 to 30 megahertz. You will notice that the SWR of this antenna is terrible on all the ham bands. 80 meters down there at the bottom, it's got an SWR that's almost infinite. 10 meter at 5 megahertz, it's is about the only place that it's resonant. It was the dip there at 5.5. 40 meters, it's non-resonant. 10 meters, 10 megahertz, it's non-resonant. 20 meters, it's not resonant. But at 17 megahertz, it is resonant. 18, it's not resonant, or 17 meters. 21 meters, 21 megahertz, 15 meters, it's not resonant. 25 meters or 25 megahertz or 12 meters, it's not resonant, but it is resonant in 10 meters. So a 43-foot vertical is only a resonant antennas at 3 frequency, 5.5, 17, and 28. At all the other good ham bands, it's a non-resonant antenna, and you should not be trying to use it with the tuner in your shack. Here you should have a remote auto tuner, in which case it will work brilliantly well. Here's how I got introduced to non-resonant antennas. This is my little mobile home that I live in. I like mobile homes. They don't take much care. But I've got a homeowners association that says you can't have any antennas. Well, I like to fool Mother Nature, but there's a lot of flagpoles in my little mobile home park. So I decided I'm going to make an HF antenna out of a flagpole. And there's my 20-foot flagpole. It's all made with 2-inch aluminum tubing, but it has 2 insulators in it. The one at the top arrow, which is the feed point insulator, and the one at the bottom, which is the bottom end, because this is a half-wave antenna. There are no radials on this antenna. Where in the heck am I going to put radials? Am I going to dig up all that nice landscaping that my wife has done over the years? Am I going to try to get radials under that pavement there, or out of, where can I put radials here? That's why I decided to make a non-resonant, off-center fed half-wave antenna, a flagpole. But this antenna needs an auto tuner, which indeed it has, because of the fact that it's a non-resonant antenna, except close to a resonant antenna on one band. Here's what the Pentagon does. Although this is a fishing trawler, deep sea going ships still use a lot of radio, a lot of HF radio, a lot of sideband these days. Any ship that goes to sea these days has sideband radio in it on marine frequencies, and they often use that Shakespeare whip, that 5300. It's a 28-foot long fiberglass whip that you see mounted there in the middle on the trawler. And you can see right at the bottom the long green arrows pointing to the auto tuner right at the base of it. Or up on the top of the cabin, there's another auto tuner, which is feeding a wire going off to a mast there up at the front of the boat. I was an avid rag sailor for a number of years and used an auto tuner to tune up the rear stay on my mast. Works brilliantly well. And these all work against a metal plate on the bottom of the boat to make contact with the ocean water for for the other side of the antenna. And this is a very common place where auto tuners are used. They're often called auto couplers. And this is in fact the very setup the Pentagon has on their roof to do a lot of work that they do. And they have a very active ham radio club. This is their website. I was surprised to see how many Marine bands there still are. A great number of them. These are the black squares here, or the black rectangles. Those are the Marine SSB shortwave bands that the ships at sea talk on. Now, when they're in near port, they talk on VHF, but VHF is only local when you're near home. When those ships are out at sea, they need to rely on SSB communications. And these are the Marine bands: 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, 16, 18, 19, 21, 25, and 26 megahertz. Sandwiched in between them, the red, are the ham bands. And you can see the Marine radio service, all on single sideband, just like we are, use as much radio as we do. That's just some FYI for you. I found it interesting. All right, let's get down to auto tuners. How do they work? Here's the original auto tuner that hit the ham market, done way back in 1996 when it appeared in an article in QST by David Kincaid, who was working for LDG at the time, who were making manual tuners only at the time, and they were the first one to come out with an auto tuner. And this is it, called the AT11. And you can see its basic innards here. It consists of two banks of reactive elements, two banks of inductors or coils, which you can see there on the right, made of toroids with various numbers of turns on it, and two banks of capacitors. They're silver mica, high voltage silver mica capacitors, and two banks of relays. And the remote auto tuner, or any auto tuner works basically on this principle. It uses a microprocessor, that CPU at the top, along with a little SWR bridge, which you can also see at the top, to look at your antenna and then decide which of those relays to close to use to match it. And that's how an auto tuner does. If any of you own an auto tuner now, you're probably familiar when you push the tune button on these auto tuners, they go, and as the relays clatter, and try out all combinations of those inductors and capacitors until they find the right combination to match your antenna, match your non-resonant antenna. Now, just a little bit of simple theory. I'm not going to try to explain Smith charts. They're way too complicated, although I'm pretty good at them. Philip Smith, who invented the Smith chart, he realized that when he was working with the Smith chart, that any place on the Smith chart, which defines pretty much any complex impedance that an antenna can have, pretty much any antenna you can throw up is going to fall somewhere on the Smith chart. And Philip Smith recognized that 4 simple circuits, which you can see here, 4 L matches, they're an L-shaped match. One of those 4 L matches will match almost any area on the Smith chart. Actually, technically, it'll match any area. It's just that the L's and the C's become rather big at certain places, so they become impractical. So Philip Smith noted that 4 simple L-match networks, which is just a coil and a capacitor, which you can make by hand if you want to, will match any antenna piece impedance, or virtually any antenna impedance. Certainly will match common non-resonant antennas, or resonant antennas for that matter. He also noticed that the 2 of those L matches, the ones on the left, which were parallel circuit in, the radios on the left and the antennas on the right of these L matches, if the parallel element was on the left, it matches the low end of the Smith chart where the impedances are low of your antenna. If the parallel element is on the output of the L match, it matches the high end of the chart but one of those 4 networks will match any antenna within reason. And here's the innards of a particular one. This is the actual innards of the LDG AT1000 auto tuner, which is about 5 feet away from me where I'm sitting. And you will notice it has 8 coils there at the top and 8 capacitors at the bottom. The coils are toroids with windings on them, and the capacitors are silver mica. But notice the values. The coils, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. Anybody recognize that? And the capacitors at the bottom working from the right, 640, 320, 160, 80, 40, 20, 10, 5 puff. Anybody recognize that sequence? Why, of course, it's a binary sequence, typical binary sequence. And that's what all these auto tuners use. They use a bank of coils and relays and a bank of capacitors and relays. And the microprocessor that reads the SWR of your antenna tries them all out, goes and switches them all in until all of a sudden the SWR bridge says, hey, that's the right one, and then leaves it there, and your antenna is matched. It also has one more relay, the one on the left. That's the one that Philip Smith said will let it match the low end or the high end of the Smith chart. And that's what it does. If it detects it's the low end, it switches over to the low side. If it detects the high side, it switches over to the high side. And the combination of those coils and those capacitors and those relays can automatically match virtually any impedance that an antenna can throw at you. Okay, let's now move a little more into some little simple theory here. I don't want to get overly complicated, but what's the fundamental reason for a tuner? All tuners, and because this will now explain why the remote auto tuner is important. Okay, here we see a basic ham radio setup. It's kind of symbolic here, but there's a source of RF over there on the left, your transceiver. Over on the right, you see where you want the power of that transceiver to go. That's the load, that's the antenna there on the right. And in between is a piece of transmission line. This is pretty basic. Most hams know all about this. I'm showing a piece of RG58 here, but can be any kind of transmission line, RG8, or it can be open wire line. Something that'll get the power from the source of RF over to the load of the RF or the antenna, so it'll make radio waves. That's the basic setup. But there's a basic relationship here that must exist for this to work right. All 3 of those, the source of the RF, the transmission line, and the load, all must be 50 ohm devices. Most of you pretty much understand an antenna being a 50 ohm device. That's the impedance at the feed point, or when you hook it up, that's where your SWR bridge hooks up and it sees a 50 ohm simple pure load. The coax, that must be 50 ohm coax. It's 50 ohm coax because of the diameters of the inner and the outer conductor. But it's made that way so it'll match the antenna that's also a 50 ohm antenna. So all 3 of them must be 50 ohms. But you might say, wait a minute, how can my transmitter be 50 ohms? Very simply. That's kind of puzzled me for a while, but I finally figured it out. It's a source of RF. Now up at the top there, what's that? Well, that's Ohm's law. Everybody knows Ohm's law. Voltage equals current times resistance, or if we're dealing with an antenna, impedance. So E equals IR or E equals IZ, Z for impedance. That's basic Ohm's law. Your transceiver is a 50 ohm device because it was designed so that when the RF comes out of the back, it comes out of it at a 50 ohm ratio. The voltage and the current that comes out of the back of your transceiver is always in the 50 ohm ratio. That's why it's a 50 ohm device, which is necessary so that all the power from it will go down the 50 ohm transmission line and feed the 50 ohm antenna, and we'll get most of the power, the maximum amount of power out into space as radio waves. All right, now we're coming to the auto tuner here. Many hams think there are 2 ways to use a tuner. And we've already said there are two ways. But it's not just a matter of there being two configurations. There are two conditions here. On the top is your transceiver with the tuner there and a piece of coax there feeding the antenna. On the bottom is your transceiver, but now the piece of coax is before the tuner and the tuner's out at the antenna. Now, this works fine. Either one of these works just peachy keen, just wonderfully. If that antenna out there is a resonant antenna. Remember, there are two kinds of antennas. For either one of these to work correctly, there has to be a resonant antenna out there. And if there is, there will be low loss in the coax or the open wire line or whatever goes between the transceiver and the tuner. If there's a resonant antenna out there, there will be low loss in the coax. But put a non-resonant antenna out there, a 43-foot vertical, a ZEP, an end-fed long wire, and so forth. Why do you think you need that 9-to-1 balun on that end-fed long wire? It's for the same reason you need the auto tuner. The auto tuner is just acting as that 9-to-1 balun. In fact, that's essentially what it's acting as. If you try to put a non-resonant antenna out there, but use the tuner in your shack, there's going to be terrible loss in your coax, your transmission line, or even in your open wire line. If you're going to put a non-resonant antenna out there in your backyard or wherever you've got it, you've got to put the tuner at the base. There really is no satisfactory compromise of this. This is basic physics. Even the ARRL says that. They say an antenna tuner is not a good idea if you're using coaxial cable after it that has high SWR in it. And when does it have high SWR in it? When it's feeding a non-resonant antenna. The tuner does provide a 50 ohm match to the transmitter, but the high SWR will still exist between the tuner and the antenna. This translates, and the ARRL is saying it, not me, this translates to high loss in the coaxial cable. This is a law that many hams don't understand, but they need to scratch it in their memory because it's very basic. All right, let me prove this to you. Here's a 43-foot vertical with 16 radials. So 16 43-foot radials, foot over average soil. So this is a perfect ground plane antenna, but it's a 43-footer. It's a non-resonant antenna. Here are the SWRs that this antenna presents to the coax on the various bands. I already showed it to you in a graph earlier, but here are the actual numbers. Over 100 to 1 on 80 meters. Now they're on 5 megahertz. It is resonant. You could use it without a tuner out there on 5 megahertz. But on 40 meters, 13 to 1 SWR, nobody's going to want to try to run an antenna with 13 to 1 SWR. And look at some of those other SWRs. They're terrible. You'd never want to do it. But if you try to put the tuner in your shack and the coax sees this kind of an SWR, it's going to really have a hissy and give you a lot of loss. And of course, the 43-foot vertical is resonant on 10 meters. You could use it without a tuner at the base. Here's my 20-foot flagpole. And again, it shows you, and I'm showing all the complex impedances here as well, but it shows you what the SWR on the right is over there on all of the bands, that 20-foot flagpole vertical, off-center fed, no radial, off-center fed, good antenna, make lots of QSOs on it. But it's got terrible SWRs on lower frequency. Look at that, 335 to 1 on 80 meters, 130 to 1 on 60 meters, 40 meters, 39 to 1. Pretty good on 14 and 10 and 30 meters, but and not terrible, but pretty bad SWRs. You try to let coax have this much SWR, and you're going to do nothing but heat up coax. You're not going to make radio signals. Let me really prove this to you. Okay. Go to your radio handbook and get it out, and you'll see the loss that they list for 100 feet of RG58 here. And the table that you'll find in the book is only if the SWR is 1-to-1. All the tables of loss in a handbook are for the SWR in the coax being 1-to-1. That is feeding a matched load or a matched antenna from a matched transmitter. That's the only time that these losses that you find in the handbook apply. But you can see what they are. That's RG58, the worst coax you can use, but a lot of hands use it. It's okay in little short runs, but certainly not in long runs. This is what it looks like for 100 feet. As you can see, maybe on 80 meters, RG58 is not bad. On 10 meters, you're losing half the power. 2 meters, you're losing 3/4 of the power. And on 440, you're way down. Got very little power coming out. But this is the best this coax can do. What happens if we let it have SWR, higher SWR, by hooking it to a non-resonant antenna? Okay, let's do that. Here's what happens to the power we're getting out. By the way, this is the percentage of power out. So, or watts out if we put 100 watts in, of 100 feet of RG58 with 10-to-1. Suppose you have your tuner in the shack and 100 feet of RG8 feeding your antenna out there, but there's a 10-to-1 on that band. This is how much power you're going to get out. The best you're ever going to get out on 80 meters, half the power. 10 meters, you're going to get 1/4 of the power out. 2 meters, you're going to get about 15% of the power out. And on 440, you're going to get very little power out. But it gets worse here. You might think, oh, I'll use better coax. All right, here's what it looks like if the SWR is 100-to-1. Terrible. But you saw some of those SWRs on that 43-foot vertical or my 20-foot flagpole were over 100-to-1. All right. Okay, you'll say, I'll use good coax. I'll go buy myself some LMR 400. And if you look at it at 1-to-1, it's got pretty good characteristics. Although even 100 feet of LMR 400 loses half the power by the time it gets to the antenna at 440 megahertz or 70 centimeters. But it's good coax. It's it'll tolerate pretty good SWR for a while. Let's take 100 feet of the LMR 400, the good stuff, but give it a 10-to-1 SWR because we've now got it hooked up to our 43-foot vertical on a couple of bands. And as you can see here, we're losing a lot of power in the coax, even really high quality coax like LMR 400. Here it is at 100-to-1. And oh boy, the power's really gone down. Interestingly, the higher bands seem to do better. And now let's say you say, okay, I won't use coax at all. I'm going to use the perfect stuff. I'm going to put open wire line between my transmitter and my non-resonant 43-foot vertical. And I'll get no loss at all. Don't kid yourself. Open wire line is not lossless. It just has less loss than coax does. Why do you think these old-fashioned ship-to-shore stations put their transmission line on telephone poles 3 feet apart? That's because they wanted to have long runs out to those big antennas on very low frequencies. I was visiting Radio Luxembourg once over there in Europe when I lived in Europe, and they transmit on low frequencies. And their transmission lines are ceramic insulators spaced 2 feet apart, and the transmission line is wire spaced 2 feet apart. But it still has loss. It absolutely does. Here is 450 ohm ladder line, which you might think, oh, that's perfect. There's no loss in that. Oh no, there's loss in it. Look at it. On 70 centimeters, you're barely getting 50% of the power out, even from open wire line on 440. Give it 10-to-1 SWR because you're trying to hook it to your 43-foot vertical. And now I notice that the scale at the bottom is expanded so that it looks pretty good, but then but it's worse here. I've expanded the scale so you see how much it drops. Let's look at it at 100-to-1 SWR, which, as you know, the 43-foot vertical or my antenna flagpole can have these kind of SWRs. Look at how much power you're getting out of this supposedly perfect open wire line. No, it's not perfect. Don't ever believe it. And here's an interesting point. Any of you ever try to use 300 ohm TV ribbon to feed an antenna? TV ribbon cable is no better than RG8 for loss. So if you think you're going to get low loss because you're running 300 ohm ribbon, forget it. You may as well use RG8. So this is the end of this story. And so the conclusion is, if you've got a non-resonant antenna and the number of them in the ham world is growing, the tuning must be at the antenna, unless you want to do nothing but heat up coax. Don't think that that tuner in your shack is going to work for a non-resonant antenna in your backyard. Here's a little sidebar. It's a ham myth that relates to this. You'll now understand it. A lot of hams think, I don't like antenna tuners. They're very lossy. No, they're not. As here's a little quote from the QRZ forum. Usually, antenna losses are very small if the tuner is built with large high Q components, and most good tuners are. Coils and capacitors don't consume power. They can't. They only transform power. Coil and capacitive reactance that you find inside of a tuner, whether it be auto tuner or a manual tuner, have no loss. The only loss they may have is a little tiny bit of dissipation. But believe me, the loss in an antenna tuner, any kind of a reasonable size antenna tuner, is extremely small. Why do hams think that tuners have high losses? Because they're trying to tune up an antenna out there that's non-resonant with a tuner. And when they do, they get high loss and they say, oh, this antenna tuner is no good. No, they're looking at the wrong thing. They should be looking at the coax, going out and feeling it and seeing that it's running hot. So let me give you one closing example here. This is a non-resonant antenna. This is an antenna that I'm really quite proud of, that I've lectured on before. This is a slot antenna, a skeleton slot, which means it's the metal part is just wire and the slot in the middle is a big open space. This is a skeleton slot antenna, a delta-shaped skeleton slot, and it's an inverted delta. By the way, if you ever build antennas, don't put them with the sharp pointed up, put them with the sharp pointed down, because they radiate off the flat part, not off the point. Anyway, this is a non-resonant antenna. It's two inverted deltas, skeleton deltas mounted 90 degrees to each other so that I can switch them and change their directivity. This particular antenna, which you'll find in my book on slot antennas, which you can get off Amazon for $5, is a vertical. It has all the good qualities of a vertical, low angle radiation, which is why a lot of hams like verticals. But this is a vertical that is horizontally polarized because it's a slot antenna. When have you ever heard of a vertical that's horizontally polarized? Why is that good? At least 3 dB better, less noise pickup. Hams sometimes don't like verticals because they're so-called noisy. Not this antenna. This is as good as a dipole up there horizontally at the top, because that's where it radiates, and it's a horizontal at the top, and it radiates horizontally at the top. And there are two of them with a typical donut-shaped pattern that I switch at the base with a couple of relays, and I can change this antenna has gain. When have you got a vertical that's ever had gain? This one has up to 6 dB gain on 10 meters, for example, and you can switch it by changing which one of those deltas you use. If you want to find out about it, get yourself a copy of my slot antenna book, which I'll show you here in a minute. how do I tune this up? I use an auto tuner, but I like this guy just as well. And this is a cheap way to put a tuner at the base of the antenna. If you don't want to spend $400 for remote auto tuner, build one of these. Go on eBay and buy yourself a rotary inductor, which this one is about 35 microhenries, and I got for about $15, I think. And there's a nice 250 puff rotary capacitor, tuning capacitor with pretty nice spacing, so it'll handle power. And it's just on a little piece of aluminum and with a plexiglass front plate, and it has little connect things at the back. This little is an L match, which, as Philip Smith said, will match anything on the Smith chart. It has to be changed, of course, and that's why those two little red and black banana connectors on the back. This enables me to change it from a parallel in to a parallel out. And the front of this one is marked with capacity and inductance, so that all I have to do is just open the sliding glass door from my shack, step out, crank the knob for the inductance, and turn the capacitor to the marks I have on the front of it, which I know what they are because I tuned this up on all bands once and I know where to put it. I just step outside, crank the knob, set the tuning capacitor, then I go back in the shack and I get nice low SWR on the coax. So this is the way I do it. It's a cheap way and a very, very good way. Or if you've got a manual tuner that you're not using, put it in a box out there just at the base of your antenna, and then just step outside. Do as I do and put it in a little Rubbermaid tub. Great fun. If you want to read about that antenna, that in double inverted delta, you can buy a copy of my slot antenna book. There's the QR code there at the right if you want to take a picture of it, or just go to Amazon.com. This is my one commercial, and just search for slot antennas for ham radio, and you'll find this along with a description of a lot of other slot antennas, which are fun too. If you haven't got it, a lot of people have enjoyed this little book. And that's it, people. There's my little doggy acting as Porky Pig. No, she doesn't have a German call sign, D0GGY. I like to just pretend she does. And that QR code will get me to my website or my email addresses. If you want to send me email, I'll be glad to correspond with you. And that's it, folks. Antenna tuners, auto tuners.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, John. David, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you so you can call on anyone with questions, or people are free to speak out. Can you handle the questions?
Alrighty. If anyone has any questions, use the raise hand feature and I will call on you.
I think I buried everybody.
Thank you, John, for your wonderful presentation.
Well, my pleasure.
Good.
I was surprised I'm surprised that people found this thing on auto tuners interesting.
Oh yeah, that's good.
It is. It's great. And David, thank you. N6DTA put out the survey of all of your topics, and this one won. So great. Thank you.
Well, have me back anytime. I've got a number of topics. You'll find them on W6NBC.com, and be glad to lecture to you anytime. This is what I wanted to do all my career. I want to be able to give presentations like this to ham radio clubs, and Zoom, and I'll hate to say it, COVID gave me the opportunity.
Thank you, John. And, it's all about sharing your experiences and vast knowledge, which a lot of people are lacking, because us old timers are starting to go away, and we need to set people straight and put out the word that it's not that hard. I prefer to keep it simple, Scott. And what can I say? It's all great. I really appreciate it. It was a great presentation. I added a lot of stuff in the chat window, but nonetheless, I started building antenna tuners when I was 15 years old. Just hadn't got my license. So yeah, Antennas and tuners have been my forte since I became a ham.
I've had a lot of fun with tuners.
So just to let you know, John, the survey was a three-way tie until the very last day. So you may be asked back for sure for some of those other topics.
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of brand new ones right now. One which some of you might find interesting: how to make a magnetic loop with PVC and aluminum foil.
Oh, sounds very interesting. David, are there any questions in the chat box? Scott brought that up, that he had some things in there. Are there any questions?
I don't see anything recent. Yeah, I only see comments through here.
All righty, guys. Well, if there are no questions, that's just fine. And we'll bid you, I'll turn on this little feature here. By the way, that's an interesting Zoom feature if you don't know about it, how to do that. How to do that. If down there in your stop video section down there in the lower left, if you click on the up arrow, you will see choose video filter. That's a video filter. Here's another one if you want to see it. There's a whole bunch of them. That one right there is one I made, and you can make them. They're just a PNG file, which has that 73 on it, and all the rest of the background removed, made transparent. So if you put it in your video filters, you can turn on anything you want to click on over the top of your Zoom image. So I'll say 73 to you, and it's been fun, and have me back. I'll be glad to come back to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to have you and sharing, as Scott said, your vast knowledge and expertise. I've been looking into the Pentagon Amateur Radio Club. It is quite an active club.
You bet it is.
Yeah.
and a fun club to talk to.
I'll bet. I'll bet.
Yeah.
Well,
okay, guys, all the best.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to
Thanks
turn
very
off
much.
recording at this time.
All right. At this time,